have a look at this. The bees have made such beautiful honey in this hive here, and you can see the way they've capped it, that the honey is nice and ready. We're going to be harvesting some live today while looking at honey in detail, looking at the different colours and flavours, and it just makes such a good gift. So honey, when people say thank you so much for the honey, I say, well, thank the bees, because it's an extraordinary thing they do to produce honey. If you think about it, they fly out, spread themselves out over a 3 to 10 kilometre radius and bring all that nectar back into the hive. And what we're going to do is just have a bit of a taste of what the flavour is in this frame right here. So all I'm going to do to harvest this is put this key in, give it a turn like that, and you can see the honey already flowing down here, and shortly it will come out this tube. Here we go. So honey is full of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, enzymes and medicinal properties. It's such an amazing thing, and if you've got questions, put it in the comments below and we'll get to answering those. Here's the honey coming down the tube now, and it looks like a nice light honey, which is a beautiful thing. In the springtime here we get the light honey coming in, and in the wintertime we get the darker tones, and it really just depends on what's flowering at the time. People often ask what makes the different colours of honey, because it's quite interesting, especially in a flow hive where you can see the different colours right in the end frame view, and even watch the bees making the honey, depositing the nectar with their tongues in the cross section you can see here of the cells. Look at that, beautiful, coming out. And you've got a light honey here in the centre, then you've got a bit of a darker honey over here and here, and as soon as we've harvested this frame, they will go and choose nectar from whatever's flowering at the moment and bring that back in. And it's actually the colour of the nectar which determines the colour of the honey. Even though you can hardly see any colour at all, once they reduce it, you get an amazing colour that then forms in your honey. It can be anything from really light, like this jar here. If you have a look, we've got a nice little gift basket Alice has made up, and you can see we've got a very, very light honey, and these are all honeys we've harvested from this location. And then on the contrast, we've got a honey that you almost can't see through. It's a very, very dark red colour. And then you've got the brown tones, more golden, typical. Mostly people think that is honey, that colour. That is our honey colour, but of course it can be black, it can be almost clear, it can be all different shades of different colours. And it's just wonderful to be able to share the flavours with your family and friends when they come. Any questions?
Yes, Cedar. Hi to everyone. Everyone loving all the different colours and the flavours of honey. Someone's actually commented, is this really live?
It is really live.
Sean's asking, do the bees make honey in the wintertime?
The bees here in this location, because we're in a subtropical region, do make honey in the wintertime. In fact, we get some really good flows in winter sometimes. Not every winter, just like any form of agriculture. It depends on the rains and the seasons and the flowers and what's going on, and just whether there's enough flowering species around to really produce a lot of honey. So in other locations, typically you can get a long, cold winter, and the bees might not be able to collect any honey at all, and you might have to wait till spring. So it just depends. If you have a look in the side window here, this is the frame we're currently harvesting. You can see the bees have hardly noticed what's going on. They're just moving around, going about their day. Some of them are going, hang on, the honey's disappeared from beneath our feet, we better start uncapping those cells, and they'll recycle that wax, rebuild the cells, and the whole process starts again.
Oh, so beautiful, thinking about the honey, the bees feeling it under their feet. Nazir's asking, how many times can the flow frames be used?
So we've built them to last a very long time. Of course, we've taken this product to market in 2015. So we're now 5.5 years in. We've still got flow frames from that original time in our hives, and we were testing for years before that. It took us about a decade to invent the flow hive with a lot of testing. So while we can't say there's a flawless record without problems, we can say we've built it to last a very long time, and that if you do have any issues with your product, get in contact with us. We will help you.
Fantastic. Cedar, Melissa's asking, if the flow frames aren't fully capped, could you take some out just to taste it first?
Absolutely. So what you can do, if you just want to have a little taste and you're not sure, you want to leave the honey for the bees, and if there's a long cold winter coming up or a time when you think there's not going to be flowers, it's a good idea to leave that honey for the bees because that's their food. So you can just taste the very last bit. And you could even taste it when it was in nectar if you were curious, because you can open just a single cell line. And to do that with this key here, you just insert it just a small way like that and give it a turn, and that'll open just the very last piece of the frame. You can have a little taste, reset it again for the bees, and that's a fine thing to do.
Fantastic. Kuji's asking, do bees store certain flavours in each frame? For example, if they're getting nectar, say, from a jarrah, will that go in one frame and then another flavour will go in another frame?
They don't necessarily isolate it completely. A single bee in its life will generally forage on that same flower until that flower source runs out. And because in foraging season they might only last four to 6 weeks, and only the last couple of weeks will be foraging, then it's likely that bee will just stick with that one flower source in its lifetime. However, there's a lot of bees in the hive and they might be going to all sorts of different flowers, so you will get mixtures depending on what's flowering. So if you've got a big flowering of the ironbark, say, then you might get mostly ironbark in your frames, but you will certainly get mixtures of whatever's around also. It just so happens that they fill from the inside of the hive out towards the extremities, and that means that if ironbark's flowering in the middle and then the melaleuca flowers, then you get that different flavour coming in there, which will be that kind of rich, darker, malty, almost burnt tones, compared to in the middle having those bright, light, aromatic flavours. So that's why you get this mixed result. And of course we come along with the flow hive and are able to harvest just single frames to your jars, and then there's an empty frame for the bees to refill with whatever's flowering at the time. So then you get this checkerboarding of totally different honeys in your hive that you can enjoy. And I would recommend isolating the honeys. Some people harvest all of the frames into a big bucket, and that's sort of come from conventional beekeeping, where you're going through that long labour intensive process of taking the frames out, taking them to a processing shed, decapping and spinning and all of that, which I used to do a lot of. And from that point of view, you come to a hive and go, while I'm at it, wouldn't I harvest all the honey? But really, you don't need to with the flow hive. You can simply just tap some jars off and enjoy those and share them with your family and friends, give them away as gifts, and come back and harvest some more when you're ready. So in that way, harvesting it all into a bucket tends to be what conventional beekeepers will do, but then they're mixing all the flavours together. Imagine what happens if you mix all of these flavours. You don't get to enjoy this amazing light aromatic, that's the wild quince honey. It's a real blowout to taste that. And then we have this incredible malty flavour, which is a little bit of coming out today actually. And I better just swap over that jar because it's about to overflow. There we go.
Fantastic, Cedar, because that brings us to a question. that, you know, when you go and buy conventional honey, it's sort of always the same colour. It's just like golden, or you don't get these tones. And I guess you've kind of answered that question, really.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing that humans, marketing, mass production has led to this demand. Well, it's, you know, it's a kind of a pseudo demand of things being homogenized. So that means milk gets homogenized, that means honey gets homogenized. So they want to have it looking the same on every supermarket shelf in the country. And what that means is they're going through a process of pasteurization where they're heating the honey, and if they heat it to a certain temperature, it won't go candied in the jar, because they want it to keep looking about like that. That's what we recognize as honey. They want it to stay like that. If they heat it really hot, it will stay like that and not go candied in the jar. Now, candied isn't a bad thing, it just looks different. So it could be harder for them to keep the homogenized look. So it's a bit of a shame though, because that kills the vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients and all the medicinal properties in the honey. So you're much better off just leaving it as it is. Let it come out of the hive, zero processing. Then you really retain all of those benefits. And what that means is sometimes it'll be light and sometimes it'll be dark, and you can't keep that homogenized look. But to me, it's much better to have different looks, different flavours, and it brings such a story about the bees to the table.
It's so true, Cedar. I think growing up in New Zealand, we had one coloured honey, and you thought that was the honey, but then you had creamed honey. So what is creamed honey?
So creamed honey, there's a couple of different things there. So there's a really fine candy, which is when, especially in a colder climate, depending on the nectar source, the honey will go candied in the jar. Now, what they do a lot of in New Zealand, and also in our cold area here in Tasmania, is they'll seed the honey with really fine sugar crystals. And if you've ever done a science experiment as a kid where you seed a saturated solution with little crystals, the solution will then propagate that crystal structure throughout the honey. That's exactly what they do to get a really fine, smooth candy, which is a really enjoyable texture. And if you ever go to New Zealand, definitely travel around tasting all the different creamed and candied honeys. And there's also whipped honey, which is where you get typically a really coarse honey that's perhaps not the most nicest texture on your tongue, and you can stick it in a blender and whip it up, and that makes it nice and smooth as well. But you'll have to keep that one in the fridge because it tends to separate if you leave it out. But a fun thing to try if you want to.
Yeah. Pauline's in North Wales in the United Kingdom. Just wondering, when's the best time for them to start? What month would be the best for them to start their beehives?
So the best time is just getting yourself prepared before spring. So get your equipment, line up the bees you're going to get from a beekeeper, have your hive already put together, and then you've given your bees the longest season, if you like, especially if you're in the cold areas. And that doesn't mean you can't start at different times of year and adaptation. So if you were to purchase a flow hive in the middle of summer, for instance, and you're in that cold area where the season's shorter, you might want to purchase some bees from an already established colony, so there's lots of bees already, and swap them into the flow hive, and that way you'll get a jump on it and they're more likely to get honey that season. If you start a bit late, not the end of the world. It just means you might not get a whole lot of honey that season, or you might not get any, but you'll be well prepared for the next one. Now, the only time you can't start a beehive, and I should really qualify what I'm saying here, you wouldn't want to start a beehive in midwinter in a cold place, or the start of winter, or the very end of autumn, because there's really not enough forage. So bees need forage to build their colonies. So take a look at the season, ask your local beekeepers, ask them what's the best time for me to start, or is it okay to start now? And it depends on which method you start with. As said, if you're just transferring a beehive to your location that's already got a lot of bees in it, then you could do that anytime. Look after them, get them through those times where there's not much nectar, and when the population's good and the hive's healthy and there's a lot of nectar around, they can produce honey very quickly, and it gets really exciting.
Absolutely, and Pauline, just on further on that question, in North Wales we do have an EU site, so you can look that up as well, that you're asking for. Just wondering also, Cedar, do you ever have problems with the hives, with the wind, with them blowing over?
So we get some strong wind up this slope here. We're right on an escarpment, and sometimes you get quite a strong breeze. It blows up at 80 kilometres an hour here. I found that it used to blow the roof off our classic hives. So when it came to redesigning for the Flow Hive 2, we put these wing screws here, which we really hardly need. The new roof has more overlap, and it tends to stay on even without those wing screws done up. So that's all we've had really, unless you've got a rickety base underneath your hive. Perhaps you've put it on some old blocks and the blocks fall over, or a cow bumps into your hive and it could knock it off, or perhaps it loses its footing. So put it on some strong pavers on the ground. You can see here we've used a block of wood, and that just gives it a nice sturdy base. And make sure you adjust your legs so that it's going to not be wobbly on its stand, and then it'll tend not to fall over even in strong winds. The hive's really heavy. If you think about the amount of honey in here, there's quite a lot. That box could weigh 30 kilograms. So it doesn't tend to blow over, except for perhaps when you first put it on and the bees haven't glued it together with their propolis. After a week or so, they'll stick this box to that box with their propolis, which is the bees' glue. They go and collect tree sap, and they will use that to stick all of the parts together, and they tend not to blow over. Sometimes they'll drift slightly out of line, and you can just push that back again. If it's really hard to push back, you can use one of those hardware clamps that you squeeze up, and that will just bring it back into line. A little tip there.
Great tip. We've got a flower from Stanthorpe. Just wondering, when is it too late in the season to do a split before winter?
So if you've got a lot of bees in your hive, then taking a split is a good idea. You can get late swarms, you can get overcrowding, causing the swarm trigger even in the autumn time. So if you open the side windows here, this isn't a crowded hive. This is on the side of being not quite enough bees, but they should build up with the nectar flow going on at the moment. But if you can't see the comb at all because the bees are really hard packed in there, then taking a split will relieve that congestion and help relieve that swarm trigger. So it's really just about when your bees have a big population, you could then take a split. Having said that, if you are in a area that does have a cold winter, so certainly be able to split in spring and summer. Late autumn, I would just leave them be and let them keep their stores through the winter and split in the springtime.
Great. And how do you know, Cedar, how much honey you should be leaving for the bees in the wintertime?
Now that's a really good question, because we do have to remember that honey is their source to get them through times when there's not enough flowers around. So let's have a look at this. We just need to swap that jar. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 jars so far out of that frame. So we're getting a lot of honey there from that single frame. So the question was?
Oh, sorry, Cedar. I'm looking at two different.
I've had a bit
screens,
of a big night here.
Yeah.
My son's just in hospital getting an X-ray on his hand, and he didn't sleep so well.
Oh,
So fingers crossed, everything's okay there. He had a little bit of a tumble. So
hopefully he's.
that question again.
I can't remember either, Cedar. I'm going to ask another question and
Okay.
come back to that one.
Somebody will remind us.
Yeah, exactly. Another question is, why is it important to face your hive either north or south? Or is it that important?
Well, the answer is it's not that important. That's come from commercial beekeeping, really, where they're after the extra little bit of production you'll get if you let sunlight come into the entrance in the morning and wake the bees up just that little bit earlier. Now, keeping bees in the backyard, you don't need that level of efficiency, I guess. So, although if you have a choice, facing it towards a little bit of morning sun will help, but considerations like the flight path of the bees, that they can get out and away without bothering anybody or your neighbours is more important than which way they face according to the sun. So if you can face it so you get a bit of sun shining in the entrance, great, but don't worry about that too much.
Great. Joel's just realised that they've put the flow box around the wrong way, so he's got to do the spin around 180 degrees. Is that going to be all right?
Absolutely. So get in your bee suit and smoker, make sure you protect yourself, of course, and it's a case of just getting your hive tool out, levering the box up so it's broken away, breaking all of that propolis that they glue the boxes together with, turning it around and putting it back on again. So it's a relatively straightforward thing to do, and of course, like everything in beekeeping, if you're feeling like you need a bit of help, don't be afraid to reach out. Beekeepers in general are a very helpful crowd, and they'll be enthusiastic to help you learn and get you going in beekeeping.
Cedar, when you first get the queen bee, this is a newbie beekeeper, wondering how do you keep the queen bee in the hive?
So the answer really is you don't. So a queen bee, if you're introducing a package, for instance, you'll get a package of bees, which is basically an artificial swarm where they've shaken a bunch of bees out of the bottom box, and they'll send that in the mail, would you believe, with a queen bee in another little cage. And we've got videos showing you how to install that into your hive. And the queen will come in a little cage, and that little cage will have a block of candy. And she'll come with about 5 escort bees because she doesn't feed herself. The little escort bees will look after her while she's in the male. And then what happens is you put all of those bees and the queen in her little cage into the hive, and the workers will chew away at that block of candy and she'll be released into the hive. But once she's released into the hive, the worker bees are used to her smell, and hopefully they'll like the home and they'll set up shop, start building comb, and away they'll go. Once they've started building comb, they rarely leave. But you can get into the situation where your hive gets overcrowded and your old queen will actually leave the hive. She's free to go. There is no fences holding her in, and it's only that we provide a nice home that they're willing to stay. And if we look after them, they will stay, and it's only then that you get the beautiful honey.
Talking about smells, a couple of people are asking, you mentioned last week about fermented honey, and just wondering, how do you know if it's fermented? Is it the scent, the discoloration, the taste?
Yeah, okay. So fermented honey you can taste straight away. It's on its way to turning into honey mead. So the answer to that one is basically the taste, but I'll explain a little bit about how and why it happens. So the moisture content needs to be below about 20%. And if you look at this honey here, it's behaving like honey. You can see that bubble moving up through the honey. If it was moving fast and it was very liquid in the jar, then the moisture content would be too high for it to keep on the shelf. You need the moisture content below 20% in order for it to keep on the shelf without fermentation occurring. Now when the bees go and get the nectar from the flowers, the moisture content's about 85 to 95%. And they need to go through an incredible process to reduce that down and make that moisture content low enough for the honey to keep. So when they do that, they're first of all flying back to the hive. They're already taking some of the moisture out with their bodies. They get back to the hive, they transfer that nectar to another bee, and then that next bee will then deposit it into the cells, but they won't just put it in and it's done. They'll actually splash it around the walls, and you can watch that process happen in the rear view window. If there's a big nectar flow, you might see all of these droplets around. Then as the day goes on, they'll then be consolidated and reduced, and they keep doing that, fanning it and reducing the moisture content, and eventually they get it to a point where it won't ferment. If you've harvested it early and it's a bit too liquid, and you can get a refractometer, it's called, to test that, then it may ferment on the shelf. So it just means you'll need to consume it, which isn't a problem in our family, before fermentation occurs. If you find it is a bit liquid, then keep it in the fridge. It will last longer there as well. Or you can decide it's time for a batch of honey mead.
Ooh.
So a few things about fermentation there, but it's basically colony forming units in the honey, which there's always yeasts and things present in your honey, but they can't actually do their thing unless there's enough water in there. So the bees are clever, and they know that, and they reduce the honey down to the point where it's going to keep, and then like a preserving jar, if you have a look here, over the top of the cells they've put a wax sheet to say, let's keep that honey for later in case we need it. And that's when you know it's ready to harvest. So the time to harvest is when they've put their capping on. And you can get a good idea of that from the side windows and the end window of when there's a lot of capping on the frames and it's ready to harvest.
Great. Cedar, you mentioned different flavours and tastes in the honey. How do you do that? How do you know which plant, where your honey's come from, or is it just years of experience from being a honey bear?
So the answer is you don't always know, but as you go on in beekeeping, you start to connect what the flowers are to the smell of the honey and the taste of the honey, and you can even go and taste nectar from flowers. And some of them are really easy to join the dots. So this one here is quite easy. If you look how clear that is, that's incredible. But the smell of that, it just really whacks you. It's incredibly bright, and when you walk past that tree, you can smell that same smell that you're smelling in the jar. So then you go, oh, okay, I've watched the bees bringing in that light colour, and I can smell that flowering now. And then next year you look out for when that's happening, and then you learn that, okay, the wild quince is that light honey with that flavour. Then you might notice that the paperbark, when that's all flowering, you get this, it starts off with like a fluoro green almost look when it comes in, then it reduces to more like a golden brown, even slightly darker than that. And the smell of the paperbark flowers is very close to the smell of the honey. And after a while you just learn more and more. But of course there's as many different honey flavours in the world as there are different types of nectar producing flowers. So you won't be able to learn them all, but it's wonderful to really start learning some of the local ones you have in your area. Citrus blossom is a beautiful one. That's an incredible honey.
Oh, yum. Cedar, we've got Jason. He's saying half his bees swarmed from his hive, but some of the flow frames have still got honey in them. Should he take the honey out, or does he need to leave it there?
Okay, so if your hive swarm, that means the old queen's left with half the bees, and what you'll find is you'll have a low number of bees when you look in the side window, or even none at first, and it's a bit like, oh, where did they go? So at that point you're going to need to look after your colony a little bit. Make sure you're trapping those hive beetles if you've got hive beetles in your area. you can slide the tray out and have a look, put some oil in there and trap some of those beetles to make sure they're not going to take over, because they will prey on a hive that doesn't have many bees to look after all of the comb surfaces. Also, you might want to get in there, do a brood inspection, make sure you've got a laying queen, because sometimes, occasionally, you will find that after a swarm, your hive will end up queenless. So get in there, have a look, and make sure you've got eggs and young larvae and brood in your hive. And if that's happening, then you can just let your hive grow, look after them, and they'll bounce back. If you've got lots of hive beetles in your area and the colony's really struggling and not bouncing back very quickly, then, as you said, you could take off the honey super, reduce the size of the hive for a little bit and let them build up before putting it back on. If you're going to do that, keep those flow frames with a bit of honey in it in a cool room or a freezer if you can, because otherwise hive beetles and things will find them even in your house, and you could get fermentation occurring in any open cells in those frames. So a few things there. Generally what I do is just look after the hive, make sure I'm catching the beetles and the population returns, and I'll leave the honey super on.
Right. Kurt's asking, you mentioned before, Cedar, that you can see the outer flow frames, that they're all capped. How do you know what's going on the inside without actually taking the hive out, or do you assume that they've worked from the inside to the outside?
Yes, okay, good question. And the answer is you don't, unless you start doing an inspection and pulling flow frames out. We've designed it so you don't need to do that to harvest your honey, but you can if you want to, and it's a good idea in the beginning just to join the dots between what you're seeing on the outside as to what's happening on the inside. And you will get colonies that, for whatever reason, don't like to fill the very last cell line, and occasionally you get a colony like that and the combs are not nice and full all the way through, but just not at the end, which is a bit annoying because it looks like they're empty when they're not. So after a while you start to gauge that it's a good time to harvest by, you can look at the side window, have a look at that. That is absolutely beautiful and ready to harvest. If I move these jars over here, then you can also have a look at what's going on in the window of the hive at the back here. So you can see that that's definitely capped and ready to harvest, and try and match that up with the rear window here. So have a look and you can see right in here that there's capping down the side of this frame. Now, interestingly enough, this very corner cell of the hive they'll often leave uncapped, so don't worry about that so much, but you can see the capping down here. So right in front of my finger there's a white wax that they've put over the cells, and the cells you can see are nice and full of honey. So that frame looks ready to harvest because you can see the capping on the outside and you can see it on the edge. The next one to the left actually looks ready to harvest too, because as you go down you can see there's quite a lot of honey in those cells and it's capped as well. The next one across to the left is looking a bit empty. I wouldn't harvest that one quite yet. So you can get a pretty good idea. In commercial beekeeping you'll generally take the honey if it's, say, 70% capped. So looking at this you can get a good idea if you've got 70% capping or more on your frames. Sometimes, however, when they get a bit hungry, and this is another thing to learn, is they will start eating the honey away. So that can typically happen right above the brood nest, and when the bees are hungry you start to get a patchy look. You can see that a little bit here, so the nectar must be coming and going a little bit at the moment. But see how you've got a cell that's full and a cell that's completely empty. So if you start seeing that pattern really showing up a lot, the bees are actually uncapping and eating the honey out of those cells. So if you start to see a lot of that, you say, well, perhaps they're eating the honey out of the centre above the brood nest as well, and maybe I won't harvest those frames. You could probably still harvest an edge frame if you really need some honey, but otherwise you can leave it for the bees. So with the side windows and the back window, and just learning and watching, you can get a really good idea of when it's time to harvest. If you've harvested too early, you'll know about it because you get honey that's a lot more liquid in your jar. And we spoke about that earlier.
Yes, Cedar, great. Margaret's wondering, what if you never took honey out of the flow hive, out of the frames? Would the bees move on to another hive, or would they just eat it all out?
So it's quite okay to leave the cells full of honey, and people sometimes do that all season, and it's really no problem. The bees are storing it for themselves. So when the bees are storing it for that long winter that may or may not come in an area like this, because we have flowers here in the winter as well. So lucky for us, they produce more than they need often, and we can share some honey as well. So, but you don't need to. You can certainly leave it in there for the bees, and they'll certainly be happy about that as well.
Cedar, is there any need to paint wax onto your new flow frames? Does it make any difference as to how quickly they will then fill the flow frames?
It's not something I do, but what I would say, rather than going to the bother of melting wax and painting it on, you can if you want to, but an easier trick to do if you do want to speed up the process of the bees starting to use the flow frames for the first time, is to scrape some honeycomb off the top of your brood frames. And if your hive is ready to super, they would have started building up some comb on top because they're looking for more space to store honey. So you get your hive tool, you've taken this top box off, you scrape off some of that, that wax or the burr comb off your frames, and just press it into the flow frame surface. You won't damage your flow frames, and put it right in the window so you can enjoy watching the process happen. The bees will actually get in there, recycle that wax and spread it onto the flow frame in that surrounding area, and that'll just get you some action a little bit quicker. People do all sorts of things and they'll put sugar on them and things like that, but I haven't seen that be helpful in any way. So generally the recipe is make sure your colony's nice and strong before you put the super on, so there are lots of bees in there, they've started to build comb on top, they're ready for more space, and if that coincides with a good nectar flow, then they'll get in there and start working those frames. But if there's not a nectar flow, it could be months and months before they start using the flow frame, so it might not even happen in your first season. So be patient and look after them, and they'll eventually get there.
Great. I love how everyone's talking today about taste and flavours and smells, and John's saying that his hive smells like sweet cakes, and he's just wondering what our hives smell like.
Isn't it amazing? What the hives smell like depends on what the bees are collecting at the time. And when you get a big nectar flow, the bees are in there evaporating that nectar, fanning it, reducing the water content, the whole office, which is just up here, starts to smell like that nectar. And it's a wonderful thing. In fact, it can get so strong sometimes with this many hives nearby that it can get almost sickly sweet, especially with that melaleuca, which is like that sickly burnt toffee flavour that's so strong. So that smell will change. If you're smelling a beautiful honey smell from your hive, it's a good sign they're on a flow. They're reducing that nectar and turning it into honey, so that's excellent.
Cedar, do you still need to inspect the brood box if you're like now we're harvesting and it's springtime? Do you need to go into the brood at all?
So the requirements for inspections really differ around the world, and the best answer is your local beekeepers. So find out from your local bee club or your local beekeepers how often you need to inspect your bees. Here in Australia, it's not quite so demanding as in other places where you've got the varroa mite, and you might need to have a plan in place to really reduce those mites in your hive. And that might involve taking the super off and doing sugar shakes and counting mites and things like that. So here you do need to get in there and inspect, especially when your hive's starting out. You'll want to make sure they're building nice and straight on the combs if you're going for natural foundation, and there's more about that in some other videos. And once they're built nice and straight and you've put the box on top, generally here we're wanting to get through every frame in every hive a couple of times a year to make sure we haven't got pathogens such as AFB or EFB residing in the brood box. And if you want some more detailed tuition on beekeeping, go to thebeekeeper.org. We've got experts from all around the world contributing to that very high quality training material designed to take you from square one right through to deep scientific knowledge in beekeeping. It's free to try and you can go and have a look there. But we've also got a lot of information on our YouTube channel and this live stream each week.
Great. Cedar, managing ants, got any tips for keeping the ants out of your hive?
Yes, so ants can be annoying. They're a cosmetic, they generally bother the bees. The bees are good at keeping them out of the hive, but it's annoying when they get behind these window covers and start laying eggs there, and it's a bit of a mess to clean up. So it comes and goes. Typically when it rains, the ants will move up to higher ground out of the soil. Now, what you can do if you've got the flow hive too is you can put some grease on the leg bolts. If you have a look down here at these leg bolts, there's a nice area there. You can go and add some grease to it, and the ants will just slow them down a lot. Of course, if you've got foliage touching your hive, the ants will just walk over the foliage instead. But if you clear all the foliage away and put some, say, white Vaseline on those bolts, that will really slow those ants down. Other things you can do if they're really annoying you is dust a bit of cinnamon behind the window covers, and they don't really like that cinnamon powder, and they'll tend to clear out. But it might take a couple of goes of brushing the ants and all their eggs away for them to disappear from your hive.
Great. LP's asking, they just want to get 1 jar of honey out. Is it okay to just harvest 1 jar, close it back up and let the bees do it all again?
Absolutely. Now, where did my flow key go? Here it is. So if you want to harvest just 1 jar, so that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 jars so far out of a frame. So you'd be going in about 1/6 of this key length. So the key goes into about there, and you divide that into 6 if you're using a jar which is this size, which is a 270ml jar, and you'd be just putting it in just 1/6, which is about that far, and turning it, and you'll get just a jar of honey or so out of the frame. You can leave the rest for your bees.
Fantastic. Cedar, what would you consider to be a reasonable flight path?
So the bees will set up their own flight path, and it depends where they're going and depends on what's in front of your hive. Typically they'll want to go out of the entrance and somewhere in that vicinity. When there's a good nectar flow that's, say, over there, you'll actually see them set up a really direct path in that direction. Well, they say beeline, but it is a wandering path, but generally going towards that area. And if they're going up and away on a good angle, they're really busy and going. And sometimes they're more in an exploratory kind of path, or sometimes they're orientating. So there's a whole lot of new baby bees and they're just working out where home is and taking their bearings for the first time, and you'll see just a whole lot of bees wandering around in a general not flight path. But I imagine your question is related to wanting to situate your hive, and we've got videos on situating your beehive and things to take into consideration. Now, if you have a fence right in front of it, the flight path is going to double back, so they'll come straight out and come past you here, which is okay, but you're more likely to get bees in your hair, which means, you know, you might get a sting on the head, which isn't so good while you're harvesting honey. So if you can and you have space, then let the bees get up and get away. So the other things about the flight path is just making sure it's not going directly to where neighbours might be bothered or where people generally walk right past, because that'll increase the likelihood of issues as well.
Cedar, does the honey out of the flow hive need to be filtered, and if not, why?
Have a look at this. All of these jars have 0 filtering, 0 processing, and they are beautiful and ready for the table, in my opinion. If you're really fussy, you could put it through a light filter as it came out of the hive, but you don't have to. And have a look at this honey coming out of the jar here. At worst, you'll get some flakes of wax or some debris that's fallen into the trough area. If you haven't cleaned it out before harvest, which I don't usually, then it could end up in that first jar that you fill. It just floats to the top and you can scoop that away. So have a look at that, there's no debris. And there was a lot of development we went through, my father and I, working out how to get the honey out of the frames in the best way. And we had lots of wins along the way. And one of them is the honey drains out of the frame, and you can see that here. Have a look at this in the side window. This is the frame we've drained the honey out of, and the honey's drained out from beneath their feet. You can see all the bees already at work, starting to decap those cells. You can see how it's turned to a light colour now, showing there's no honey beneath their feet, and all of the wax has stayed in there for the bees to reuse and recycle, so that's why it doesn't come out. In the conventional way, if you're used to conventional harvesting with the decapping and honey spinner and so on, you'll end up with a lot of wax in your honey that will need filtering, and I'm so glad I don't need to do that anymore.
Fantastic. And look, Nicole's come back and reminded us of our question, Cedar, that we were both forgot before. It was basically how much honey we leave in the hive for winter for the bees, and they're about to add another 10 frame, a brood box, to their hive. I'm not sure where they are actually located, and would that be too much to leave for them?
Okay, how much you need to leave depends on your location, so do find out that from your local beekeepers, and maybe ask a couple of people, because the opinions will vary. I've been to the most southern state here, Tasmania, and one beekeeper swears that you need 2 10 frame, which is the slightly bigger size than this one, boxes of honey on top of your brood box for them to survive the winter. Then you go around the corner to another commercial beekeeper and they say, no, a setup like this will survive just fine with a single 8 frame brood box and a box of honey on top. So you will get variations, but in general, if you've got many months of cold winter, you will need to leave them a box of honey. And leading up to winter, if you find they don't have any honey stores, then feed them some sugar syrup. We've got a video, I think it's called Making a Quick and Dirty Honey Feeder, which you can look up, and there's simple ways to make a feeder to feed them sugar syrup so they can build up stores for the winter time. If you've missed the mark and it's getting already cold, then there's still things you can do. It's not a good idea to let your bees starve. So even though feeding sugar to bees isn't the best, it's also better than letting them starve and die out during the winter.
Right, Louise is asking, should you put your hive under shade through summer if it's really hot?
So if you could give summer shade to your hive and winter sun, especially in the morning, that's the ideal. These hives are out in the sun all year round, so bees can be in full sun or full shade and do fine. If I had a choice, I'd go for full sun over full shade, but if you have the situation where you can put them say just under an overhanging tree or even under the roof of your veranda, if you're happy to have the bees that close to your house, or perhaps you've got another structure on your farm. In some countries they make big honey houses just for their bees with lots of hives in them with a roof over the top. So if you can give them shade on those hot afternoons in summer, fantastic, but it's not a necessity. The reason why I would choose full sun over full shade is in those shady times, especially if you get a wet, shady, cool part of the season, you can get pathogens such as chalk brood taking hold in your hive, and sometimes just relocating the hive into a sunny area will fix that issue.
Right. Cedar, Vicky's asking, once you've harvested, do the bees then go back and eat the capping?
They don't eat the capping, but they'll chew it away, and they will recycle a lot of the wax inside the hive, rebuilding all of those cells, coating all the flow frame parts in wax, and then the whole process starts again as they deposit their nectar, and away they go.
Oh, fantastic. Chris is asking, how do you deal with cockroaches?
So, so cockroaches aren't generally an issue. I guess if you've got cockroaches hiding in parts of the hive, you could simply just shoo them away. Let's say you've got a whole lot of debris in your tray under here, and the cockroaches have moved in there for whatever reason. Just clean out your tray, give them nothing to feed on, and the problem will go away.
I'm glad we don't have that down here in the apiary. Cedar, if there's a shortage of flowers, are bags of sugar a good alternative?
There's all sorts of ways that you could feed your hive, and if the bees are starving and they've got no stores and you've got a time coming up with no flowers, then by all means feed them. You don't want them starving. So you can do what's called a thick syrup, which is a solution. If you look it up, you'll find that mixing up that solution of sugar and water, that will stimulate them to store that that syrup as if it were honey, and that'll give them some stores. You can also do dry sugar feeding, which is simply getting the flow frames or a brood frame that's empty and pouring dry sugar over it and putting it back into the hive. They will then go and collect water and bring it back and break that sugar down, and also that will help keep your bees alive during those times when they don't have quite enough. We've got time for one more question.
Oh, there's quite a few coming on.
Or a couple more. Okay.
Would you leave, this is someone in Victoria, would you leave your super box with the queen separator on during winter in Victoria, in Australia?
I would say no. So you do get a very long cold winter, and the issue of leaving the queen excluder, which is what you can see here between the two hives, it's just a little black stripe. You can get a better visual on it on this side because it happens to be just poking out a little bit there. That black line is a grid that the queen can't get through, and that means she won't be laying any eggs in the box where you're collecting honey, which is our flow super. Oh look, a bee's just landed in our jar. So it's the first bee that's come around, and if you find bees are coming, it's a good idea to cover it up. So what we're going to do is just fish that out, and I'll show you how to do that now. So all I'm going to do is use my flow key to fish out that bee, and I'll put it back on the landing board to be cleaned up. So I've got it there now, and if I come around to the front of the hive, I'll just see if I can drop it right on the landing board, and that way the bees will clean her up and she will be just fine. Now I've got a second bee stuck in the honey. There we go. Okay, straight in the hive, no problem.
Nice work.
So a good idea, don't leave honey exposed if the bees are coming to eat it. So one bee noticed, but what can happen is one bee will come and go, wow, that's a great source of honey right behind the hive. We'll go back, do a dance, and then you get a lot of bees coming for that source of honey. So you want to pack things up at that point, or at least cover the jars with a mesh or a plastic kitchen wrap or a honeybee wrap.
Oh, perfect.
So getting back to our question.
Cedar, do bees see colours? And if so, does it matter what colour you paint the roof? And also, do they seem to like the purple and blue flowers, people are wondering?
So the purple is a very popular colour for bees, especially a lot of the native bees here in Australia. You get the blue banded bee coming and all sorts of native bees, which is fantastic to plant them, provide an area, a safe place without insecticides for species that are on the brink of extinction to come and forage. And what you might just do is provide a stepping stone for bees across the urban landscape in order for them just to increase their range and connect together wild spaces again. And that's a really important thing for us to do as humans, is provide habitat for those species that need it. So plant flowers, any flowers are great. Purple ones really do attract a lot of pollination, and for whatever reason. But bees, if you have a look at how bees see, it's really quite interesting. They see colours really differently to us. They almost see this flower here, how it's got these crazy halos around the petals. they'll see a coloured flower kind of like that, where there's a lot more variation in a petal than we see, and that's I guess happened and evolved that way so that they can find flowers easily.
Oh, beautiful. Cedar, can you move the flow frames around in the super, like if you want to put the outer ones in the inner ones, or move them out if you think they're not filling up?
Absolutely, you can get in there, move them around. The more you get into your hive and learn about bees, the better. And every time you go in, you'll learn something new. So by all means, get in there, get out your bee suit and your smoker, wear your gloves, protect yourself if you're new to beekeeping, and move things around and see what effect that has, and that's how we learn. So I'm going to close this off now. We've already got our 6 jars of honey, and we'll leave that last jar filling, but I'm going to just insert the key now into the top slot and complete the harvesting process. Now all I have to do is turn that handle like that, except for I've put a honey jar in the way, and now all of those cells are moving back into the position that it's ready for the bees to wax up and reuse them. Oh, look, we got another bee just jumped in the jar, so good time to pack it up.
Pack it up. Cedar, maybe it just brings us to this last question, is once you've done that and you've closed it off, you take out that the honey tube, do you need to clean in the channel, gully?
Okay, that's a good question, and we'll get to that one. And just a tip, it's a good idea to leave that there for 30 seconds or so, because what's happening is all of these parts are moving from that to that, and the wax and propolis has to move too. So if you just go for a quick turn, it might actually bounce back a little bit, and then you'll get the cells not quite formed correctly. So leave it in there for 30 seconds or so, and that'll make sure your cells form back to the right honeycomb shape for the bees. Now, in order to finish the process, I will show you just how to do that before I put that bee back on the landing board. You've got your little cap here. Make sure you keep those when you pull them out. We do have spares in our box in case you lose them. And what we're going to do is just swap this tube for this. Now, what's going to happen then is there's a gap between this area here where you can see there's little ridges and the surface where this comes into contact, and that's for the bees' tongues, so that you'll be able to watch the bees' tongues lick up through these little areas here as they clean up the last of the honey, and that saves you having to clean that area. Sometimes bees being bees will block it up and you'll get honey building up in this area. I can't see any on this hive for an example, but if you have a look here, you can see the little gap I'm talking about. And when that's free, any honey that goes into that area will just drain back into the hive for the bees to reuse. So that works quite nicely until they block it up. So every now and then you might need to get in there and unblock that. On the end of the tube, we've designed a little auto unblocker, so each time you harvest, it'll do that job for you without you having to think about it. Thank you very much for all your questions. I'm just going to swap that now to complete that harvesting process, and you can also rest it on the edge of your jar like that, and the remaining honey will fall into the jar once the honey's at that end and we've found balance point. There we go there. Or you can enjoy eating that last bit of honey. Thank you very much for watching, and before we go, we won't forget to put that last bee back on the landing board. If you've got questions, put it in the comments below and we'll keep answering them, and we'll also let us know what you'd like us to cover next week so we can help answer your questions and get you started in this amazing world of beekeeping. After all, it's only when we look after our bees that we can enjoy the amazing rewards and be able to share that with friends and family and everyone.